go through the night. If you want to stay at that site, you're going to see the survey questions as they come up. There's going to be Q&A. Reeves is going to do some great survey stuff to help us understand Amendment B. And then with each proposition, you can submit questions, and you can upvote questions that other people have submitted. And so as we explain the propositions, once we're done explaining them, we'll take questions in the order that they show up. /poll, P-O-L-L. It's on the screen right here, sola.church/poll in any browser. My bad.
Descending on the hill tonight. Tall trees are bending to your will tonight. Oh, let the mighty bow down at the thundering sound of your voice. And I can hear the howling wind and feel the rain tonight. Every drop a prophet in your name tonight. Oh, and the song that they sing, it is washing me clean. But how long until this curtain is lifted? How long is this the song that we sing? How long until the reckoning? Every soul tonight. You see the teardrops as they roll tonight down the faces of the saints who grow weary and faint in your fields. And the wicked roam the cities and the streets tonight. But when the God of love and thunder speaks tonight, oh, I believe you will come. Your justice be done. But how long until this curtain is lifted? How long is this the song that we sing? How long until the reckoning? Oh, the reckoning. You are holiness and grace. You are fury and rest. You are anger and love. You curse and you bless. You are mighty and weak. You are silence and song. You are plain as the day, but you have hidden your face. For how long? And I am standing in the stillness of the reckoning. The storm is past and rest is beckoning. Mighty God, how I fear you, and I long to be near you. Oh Lord, how long until this burden is lifted? Do you feel the world is broken? We do. Do you feel the shadows deepen? We do. But do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from getting through? We do. Do you wish that you could see it all made new? We do. Is all creation groaning? Is a new creation coming? Is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst? Is it good that we remind ourselves of this? Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy of this? He is. Does the Father truly love us? Does the Spirit move among us? And does Jesus, our Messiah, hold forever those he loves? Does our God intend to dwell again with us? Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He is David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. From every people and tribe.
All right, hello everyone, good evening. Welcome to the ballot forum tonight, the Blue Book and Brotherly Love. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a cold night. What I want to do, how I want to kick off the meeting tonight is just kind of frame what we're trying to do, give a couple instructions, set some ground rules for interaction, and then kind of go over what the night is. But tonight is made possible by Sola Church, so thank you, Sola, for giving us this space. Also, I want to give a big shout out to all of the Denver and campaign folks. It's great. Yeah, thanks for all the participation. Thanks for all that is going on. But a little bit about the AND campaign. For those who haven't heard or aren't familiar about it, the AND campaign is an organization that is really geared towards educating and engaging Christians for civic and cultural engagement in the public space. We feel that the Christians have a lot to say and have a lot of input, but we want to make sure that we frame it in a way that says, how can we now love your neighbor as yourself through the political framework of politics? So that's a lot of what we want to cover tonight, and that's how we want to frame our discussions going forward. So just a couple ground rules, and then a couple instructions, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Mark, if you want to head on tonight's agenda. So we have a really good agenda set forward tonight. One thing I would encourage everybody to do right now, if you haven't done it already, and for those online, go to sola.church/poll. We will have some poll questions happening throughout the night. We want to kind of just understand who we're talking to, who the audience is, where everybody kind of leans, and just understanding the bigger political picture here for us. Keep that website open. There will be pop quizzes. There will be other things going on that would be very interesting for us to see. So couple ground rules. Thank you for being mindful of our COVID procedures. That you do keep your social distance, at least 6 feet. Keep your mask on at all times. If you need to use the restrooms are out there in the hallway, and you can use that as necessary. So a couple quick ground rules. One, we realize in today's political climate that there are a lot of different opinions and strongly held opinions, and we want to respect that. So I encourage us to engage respectfully. We know that two candidates running for president right now will govern in completely different ways when it comes to different issues: healthcare, religious liberty, abortion, immigration, and economic philosophies, racial justice and criminal justice. But it will also impact the current public discourse. So I would ask that we engage each other respectfully following these 4 policies. And I get these 4 policies from this book, Compassion and Conviction. It's an easy read. It's pretty inexpensive. I recommend getting it to understand how to frame politics from a love your neighbor worldview. So these 4 things. 1, hold out hope for your political opponent's best possible motives. It's too easy to characterize the opposite side and paint an incorrect picture of what they actually believe. So hold out the best hope for your political opponent's best motives. Affirm the true and good in your opponent's arguments. Tonight you're going to hear, we're going to have discussions around 4 different policies or initiatives or proposals. Some of them are confusing, some of them are pretty straightforward, but I would ask that you affirm the true and good in your opponent's arguments. Avoid deception and manipulation. Stay true to what is true, affirm what is true. And then lastly, understand that we are called to ground our political engagement in service, not in power. So we want to frame that as we have the conversation today. So feel free to disagree where you feel that you need to. That is okay. But one caveat to that: don't pull out the partisan talking points. You can have questions, you can have disagreements, but frame your disagreement around the paradigm of how can I use politics to love my neighbor as myself. So frame your discussions, frame your questions around how I can best love and serve my neighbor. Okay, so with that, the sola.church/poll should be up and running. Tonight's agenda, we will have a speaker coming to talk about Amendment B, the Gallagher Amendment. Just a quick introduction on Reeves Brown, who is very kind to give us his time tonight. So Reeves Brown is an independent public policy consultant and project coordinator for the Building a Better Colorado project. Building a Better Colorado wants to address our common challenges in a way that bring people together. A diverse, nonpartisan coalition of Coloradans has come together with the shared belief that Colorado can do better than the divisive arguments that have come to dominate our political discourse. Reeves has served on Governor John Hickenlooper's cabinet as Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, where he's led all the employees in providing technical assistance on all local government administration, housing solutions, and property tax administration. So thank you, Reeves, for being here. Next, we have Mark Gomez, who most of you should know. He's an elder here at Sola Church, Colorado native, and one of the smartest guys I know. Pick his brain. You'll be talking for hours. And then we have Blythe Scott, who is here. She's the Chief of Staff for the State Representative and Senator-elect James Coleman. She's about to complete her master's degree in political science and studied quite a bit on how Christians and policy issues, how they can work together. That's going to be her main thesis. So with that, I would like to turn things over to our moderators, and welcome Reeves Brown. So please welcome. Thank you.
We just got a comment that the audio just got really quiet.
I got it. I'm working on it. Thank you.
Okay, just one more.
Yep. She just came to see the same thing. I'll work on it.
Okay, I'll stay way back here.
This thing
I
like
tried
timed
to
out
do
and
this
powered
once
off.
when I presented.
Oh, seriously?
3 weeks ago at Colorado Mountain College.
I'm getting like texts that people can't hear. So
Getting ramped up and I'm.
better now?
I think so.
Mask in, it's ugly.
I'll take it over.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I had never heard of the AND campaign, until I
I
spoke
did
with Lisa
that one
Mark,
when he's talking.
2 days
Or
ago.
this one. 'Cause they can see
And,
it.
as
do
a
this one when he leaves.
Christian since I was 12 and then manager of a project that's trying to improve public policy to the state, I struggled with trying, how do you reconcile this? And anyway, so I got the book today, it arrived in the mail today, I bought your book. I just love what I'm hearing here. So anyway, so yeah, I've even got tattooed on here. Love the Lord, love your neighbor, right? That's the
Hey,
whole
Mark,
Bible, right there.
is the
Right?
audio
If you can't
inputting?
get anything else right,
They're just,
just
I'm getting
love God,
texts that
love
it's
your neighbor,
quiet.
and the rest will
It
work
sounds
out.
good in here.
So anyway, thank you for that. So Renee asked me to talk a little bit about Building Better Colorado before you get into the Gallagher Amendment, because she thought that was kind of interesting. So I'm going to do that here. First off, does anybody know where this is? Gateway, Colorado, just south of Grand Junction, a 5-star resort. If you ever get a chance to go there, it is the best staycation in the state. It's amazing. It's amazing. How about that?
Molly Brown House.
There we go.
How about that? Black Canyon, the Gunnison? Vance Fort? Somebody's been all over the state. Boulder, Colorado. 1920. So I love that one. There's just too much irony there. So Building Better Colorado, there was a group that started in 2015, statewide civic leaders from across the political spectrum who kind of shared a collective frustration at the inability of our traditional political process to bring Coloradans together for common sense solutions. And a firm belief in the pathway, that the pathway to a better Colorado is really to engage Coloradans in their communities in a conversation, a statewide conversation about what we want our state to be. And so we believe that we have the best form of government on the planet in our republic, our representative democracy. But no form of government is perfect. Every form of government has inherent flaws, and the inherent flaws in our system of government is it only works to the extent that people participate, and that when they participate, they are informed. And increasingly in this age of digital social media and 60-second sound bites, people are less and less informed and more opinioned. And that is a really dangerous recipe to engage people in writing public policy. And so Building a Better Colorado grew up around that. Our representative democracy rewards the loudest voices in the public policy debate, as it should. But sometimes the loudest voices don't represent the broader public opinion. They're just loud. Sometimes they don't even represent an intelligent opinion, but they're really loud and they suck up a disproportionate amount of oxygen in the public policy debate. And our two-party system, which we believe is the best form of government on the planet, okay, but it's not perfect. And there's a challenge in that our two-party system is not designed to bring people together. It is designed to accentuate our differences so I can win and you can lose, or you can win and I can lose. It's a zero-sum game, right? There's no prize for second place in a two-party system. And so trying to bring people together to engage
Constructive dialogue to build a better Colorado cannot be done in the traditional political arena. It cannot be done under the gold dome. It can't, despite the best efforts of everybody down there. They are juxtaposed. So that's how Building a Better Colorado came about. So who are we? We're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy effort started in 2015. Again, we believe that the pathway to better Colorado is really to engage Coloradans in conversation about what we're doing. So we are doing that. We hosted 2 statewide conversations. I'll talk more about that. But important to emphasize what we're not doing. We are not advocating for any outcomes. We're not advocating for problem, we're not advocating for solutions. The only thing we're advocating for is an honest, constructive, fact-based conversation. And so we have hosted meetings in 37 communities around the state, and there's 2 fundamental tenets to our model. Number 1, we don't host public meetings.
because our observation has been public meetings typically attract a disproportionate amount of ideologues and idiots that are pushing a political agenda or an organizational ideology. And that's not what we want. We want a constructive conversation. And so we work with established community leaders in all 37 of those communities, starting with the mayor, county commissioner, superintendent of schools, CEO of the chambers, CEO of the community foundation, and college president. And we go through this exhaustive, clunky, what we call a name storming process to identify who in your community is respected and who gives back and who cares and who collectively as a group looks like the diversity of your community. That's how we build our audiences. The second tenet of our model is we do not advocate. We don't advocate for a problem or a solution. We are all about empowering the audiences we engage to determine, is there a problem, and if there is, what's the solution? All we do is tee up the topic du jour. People ask who's funding it. We are funded by the benevolent funding community, a number of statewide foundations. You can see here, Anschutz, Betcher, Bohemian, Buell, Caring for Colorado, Gates, Mile High, and Piton Foundation. So we've hosted 2 statewide conversations in 2015 and then last year in 2019. We engaged over 10,000 Coloradans in that conversation. We looked at over 80 different policy ideas in 3 different policy areas. How we amend our state constitution, the ballot process, the election system, and fiscal policy. And we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Oh dear, doggone it. Just a second. I need to, can I touch your?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I can. Boogers. I need your help, Mark. Back. Oh wait, maybe I got to go down here. No. How do I get rid of this? Whoops. Do you know how to do this?
I don't think it will if we don't, unless we go back.
Oh, we can go back and jump to it.
No, I mean, we'd have to go out of the show and fix it.
That's okay if we can do our.
Okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry about
No
that. Yeah,
worries.
then just delete that.
Okay.
Delete that box.
Oops.
Boom.
This box.
That box. Delete that box and then jump right back in there. Slideshow from current slide. Yep, that's it. Perfect.
Okay.
He is the smartest guy. You weren't kidding. Okay, so in 2 statewide conversations, we've actually had, I didn't update this part, we've actually had 6 consensus recommendations grow out of that, looking at 80 different policy ideas. Number 1 was that our initiative process for ballot measures should be more inclusive of the entire state, and it should be harder to amend our state constitution than state law. That idea, subsequent to us making that recommendation in 2015, and again, us was 1,500 people around the state. That idea was taken to your ballot in 2015. A majority of Coloradans voted for it. That's now state policy. A second idea is it should be easier for unaffiliated voters to participate in the primary of their choice. They shouldn't have to affiliate with a party and then unaffiliate to participate. Subsequent to us issuing that recommendation, that went to your ballot by a separate campaign in 2016. That is now state policy. A third idea, we should reinstate a presidential primary in Colorado so that every voter gets a chance to check the box beside the presidential candidate of their choice. Up until 2016, we left it to the 2 major parties to host a straw poll at their respective state conventions. So that was also taken to your ballot in 2016. That's now state policy. A fourth idea was to exempt something called the hospital provider fee from the state revenue limit. I won't get into that. This is something that the state the legislature had wrestled with for 3 years prior to that. We made that recommendation in 2015. The legislature adopted it the next year. And the fifth one was that we should remove the state's Tabor revenue limit. That was on your ballot last fall, Proposition CC. It failed by 7 points. And the last one was that we should repeal the Gallagher Amendment, which is on your ballot this year, which is what I'm here to talk about. So that's building a better Colorado. So what is the Gallagher Amendment, and how will it impact Coloradans in 2021? So to understand the Gallagher Amendment, you have to understand what property taxes are. So here's the first quiz poll. So does this appear on their phones? Is that right?
It does, yeah.
That's awesome. So does this question appear there?
It's about to.
It's about to. It's about to, because the smartest man in the world is pulling the strings behind the curtain.
I'm not. It's Mark, yeah.
So what percent of total statewide property tax that's collected across the state, what percent of that benefits local school districts? And Mark or whomever back there, I need you to tell me when or do you just pull it up?
It's going to come up over here.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so a majority of you said 15%. And the answer, so I can advance this, right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, so yeah, I'm over here now. So 50%. So here's what you need to know about property taxes. They are valued locally. They are collected locally. They are spent locally. The state gets no benefit from property taxes. State hasn't had a property tax since 1964. Property taxes entirely benefit the funding of local services, and the biggest benefactor is K through 12, receives half of all property taxes at the local level. It's the local share of the local-state partnership. Since statehood in 1876, local governments and the state government have shared the funding responsibility for K through 12. It's the largest part of your local budget. It's the largest part of your state budget. Local governments get another fourth of property taxes, county governments, to pay for county services, county sheriff, county administration, county roads. Special districts get another 20%. So fire district, ambulance district, library district, recreational districts. So property taxes pay for local services, okay? Also, to understand Gallagher, you have to understand how your property tax bill is calculated, which is a very simple two-step formula. The amount of property tax that you pay, like on a house, is simply the assessed value of your property, which is the market value, whatever you can sell your house for in this example, times an assessment rate that dictates how much of your house or your property is actually subject to taxation. Because no property is taxed at 100%. It's some fraction. And in Colorado, all property in the state, farmland in Sterling, industrial property in Grand Junction, vacant land in Colorado Springs, small businesses in Denver, all property in the state is taxed at 29% of its total market value. That's not what the tax is, that's just how much of the property is subject tax, except residential property. And this is where the Gallagher Amendment comes in. The Gallagher Amendment taxes residential property on a formula, and residential property is currently taxed at 7.15% of the market value. So, okay? And so you take market value of your property times the appropriate assessment rate for your class of property to determine how much of your property is subject to be taxed, and then you simply multiply that by the number of mills that the voters in your district have approved to fund local services. Each mill that voters approve generates $1 for every $1,000 of assessed value. Okay? So I'll put some numbers to this so you can see how this works. Let's say you had a $500,000 house. The Constitution, we put these rates in the Constitution in 1982. The Constitution says, per the Gallagher Amendment, 7.15% of your house is subject to tax, okay? So of your $500,000 house, only $36,000 is actually taxed. You get that? Does that make sense? And if you live in a district where the voters have approved 60 mills to fund all local services, which is about average, each mill generates $1 for every $1,000 of assessed valuation, so 60 times 36, the annual tax bill on your $500,000 house is $2,160, okay? It's pretty simple, but nobody knows it. Nobody understands it because either they rent and they don't pay property tax, or else they pay a mortgage and they just write a check to the mortgage company, and the mortgage company pays the tax. They think the property tax fairy's paying it. No, you're paying it. It's just this is how it works, okay? So where did the Gallagher Amendment come from? The legislature referred the Gallagher Amendment to Colorado voters in 1982, and at that time, of all property in the state, right, houses in Durango, farmland in Lamar, all property in the state, oil and gas production, all property, houses statewide made up about 45% of total valuation, and everything else was 55%. And the Gallagher Amendment simply said, that's a good ratio. Let's keep it forever. And so when the Coloradans adopted the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, they froze into the Constitution that forevermore, houses would never represent more or less than about 45% of total value in the state, okay? So why did the legislature refer the Gallagher to voters in 1982? Well, if you were here how many of you were here in 1980? Not many. I wasn't either. I've been here 30 years. My wife's a native, and I'm so tired of hearing about it.
I was too.
If you were here in the 70s or 60s, you know we were experiencing some pretty significant population growth. Colorado had kind of been discovered as an international ski destination, thanks in large part to the Colorado Mountain Division coming home from World War II, and they developed Colorado ski industry. John Denver was singing our praises in the 70s, and people were moving here. And that was driving up property values, which was driving up property tax, and that was prompting homeowners to call their legislator and say, do something. The legislature's answer was to freeze residential share of total valuation at 45%, the Gallagher Amendment. At that time, in 1982, we thought all those people moving to Colorado was an anomaly. And it turns out it wasn't an anomaly. We have seen significant population growth for 50 years. And all of those people moving here has, not surprisingly, driven up the value of residential property in the blue. Going back to 1983, you can see the growth of residential property in the blue has far outpaced the growth of everything else in the brown. Everything else being industrial property, commercial buildings, farmland, oil and gas production, everything else. Somebody challenged me on this slide a couple weeks ago and said, that can't be right because commercial property has not been flat. It's not flat. It's gone from 30 million to over 200 million. But it looks flat when you compare it to the exponentially higher growth of residential property. Residential property has grown every year since 1983, except for the brief 4-year mortgage meltdown during the subprime mortgage crisis. Other than that, residential property has grown year over year, regardless of the economy. Okay? So it's grown so much that today, I got a quiz. You can see why I can't wear this thing when I'm talking. Right? So in 1982, we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, and at that time, remember, of all property in the state, houses made up 45%. How much do you think houses makes up of the total property valuation today? 35%, 45%, 55%. This is cool. What platform are you using for this?
This is Poll Everywhere.
Poll Everywhere. Okay, cool. All right, and the majority of you said 70% of you, 75%, 70, 80% said 70%. Okay, and you're very close. 80%. 80%. Houses make up 80% of total valuation statewide today, and everything else makes up 20%. Okay? But when we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, we said that's not possible. Houses can only make up 45%. So how does your legislature make 80% equal 45% to comply with your constitutional mandate? Well, you have to go back to our formula. If Gallagher says that the value of houses statewide can never be more or less than about 45%, and yet the market value of houses is rising faster than the market value of everything else, the only way to keep the value of houses at 45% is to shrink the assessment rate on houses. How much of each house is actually subject to be taxed? And that's what we've done for 38 years. Gallagher Amendment has formulaically reduced the residential assessment rate. It started at 21% in 1983. Quiz, what do you think it is today? Almost. Okay, here we are. So when we adopted the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, I'll explain. Well, so a majority of you said, about half of you, 40%, said 7.15, and that's the correct answer. These quizzes that I insert here, they kind of mix up my mojo here. But it does give me a chance to breathe, so that's a plus. So in 1982, before we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, all property in the state was taxed at 30% of its market value, all property. When we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, we dropped the assessment rate on houses to 21% the first year in 1983. After that, we put it on this formula that was intended to go up or down, the assessment rate on houses, depending on what the value of houses was in the state, in order to keep houses' share of total valuation at 45%. And because houses have outpaced the growth of everything else year over year, Gallagher's formula has simply forced the residential assessment rate down for 38 years to the point today it's at 7.15%. At the same time we adopted that formula for houses, we froze the assessment rate on all other property at 29%. Used to be 30%, all property is 30, we froze it at 29. Why did we go from 30 to 29? Because that's how you get voters to vote for the Gallagher Amendment. You tell businesses, we're going to lower your assessment rate from 30 to 29. And so they voted for it. And we're going to tell homeowners, we're going to drop yours to 21. Yeah! And homeowners vote for it, and so that's what's happened. But because the residential rate has gone from 21% down to 7.15%, the business community's share of the property tax burden has subsequently gone up. Their share, relative to the rate of residential share, is now 4 times as much. They both used to be taxed equally at 30%. Today, businesses pay 4 times as much, a little over 4 times as much, on the same value of property. Okay? So here's what that looks like in some real numbers. In 1981, if you had a $300,000 house, 30% of it was subject to tax. All property was taxed at 30%. If you lived in a 60 mil district, which is about average, your annual tax bill on your $300,000 house was $5,400 to pay for that pie chart of services, okay? If you had that same $300,000 house today, I'm adjusting the math here for inflation, just to make the math simple. If you had an inflation-adjusted value today of $300,000, only 7.15% of your house is subject to tax, about a fourth of what it was 38 years ago. If you live in the same 60 mil district, your tax bill in inflation-adjusted dollars has dropped to under $1,300, about a fourth of what it was 38 years ago. And that's happened on every house in the state, and that's eroded that residential tax base that funds all those local services. Conversely, if you owned a business in 1981 that was $300,000, again, all property at that time was subject to a 30% tax rate. If you lived in a 60 mil district, your tax bill was the same as your $300,000 house, okay? Today, if you have that same $300,000 business, your tax rate is slightly lower, 1%, but it's fixed at 29%. And even though your tax bill is slightly lower than it was 38 years ago in inflation-adjusted dollars, it's over 4 times what homeowners are paying, or what you're paying on your house if you own a $300,000 house, okay? So Gallagher requires the legislature every 2 years to evaluate what has been the change in value of houses versus everything else to make sure that houses stay at 45%. That study began in July. It will be delivered, it's done by the Division of Property Tax. It will be delivered to the legislature next winter, and they will act on it. And it looks at, again, change in value of residential versus change in value of non-residential over the last 2 years. If that study finds that the two classes of property have grown about the same rate, then Gallagher won't mandate any change. But if that study finds that residential property has outpaced the growth of non-residential again, then Gallagher will dictate that the residential rate has to go down to keep residential share at 45%. Conversely, if the study finds that non-residential property has actually outpaced the growth of residential, then as it was intended, Gallagher would say the residential assessment rate must go up to keep it at 45, but it can't, because 10 years after we adopted Gallagher in 1982, we adopted the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in 1992, which is also in the Constitution, and it says no tax rate can ever go up without a statewide vote of the people, which has never happened. So in that event, the residential assessment rate will just stay flat. So when we look at this chart again, the big question is, how much over the last 2 years has residential value grown or shrunk relative to non-residential? And so we're going to blow this chart up and just look at the last 10 years of this chart to find that answer. So this is the same chart going back to 2009. When we look at the change in value in residential property over the last 2 years, no surprise, residential values in the blue have grown. Okay, nobody's surprised by that. But we have had a recession since March or April, right? But that recession has not affected the value of houses. Just as we looked at that chart that's grown for 38 years, the houses have grown regardless of the recession. So we do not expect the recession, which has slowed the sale of some houses, it has not affected the value. So we can fully expect that the current 2-year valuation is going to peg the value of residential property statewide at north of $900 billion, an all-time record high, approaching $1 trillion. When we look at non-residential property and how that's changed over the last 2 years, there's two classes we're going to look at. We're going to look at commercial buildings, and we're going to look at everything else, because those two classes are valued on 2 different time frames that are affected differently by the recession. So as concerns commercial buildings, that's valued on the same 2-year window that houses are. So that study is going to look from July 2018 to June of 2020. Commercial buildings are largely valued on their rental capacity. And given that 20% of downtown Denver is rented to oil and gas companies, and given that we've been in an oil crash since last December, we can expect that's going to have some downward pressure on commercial valuation. Additionally, we've had the recession since March or April. And even though the recession hasn't affected the value of houses, it has most definitely affected the value of commercial rents, right? It's killed them. And so we can expect the combination of the oil crash and the recession probably going to lower the value of commercial buildings by 4 to 6% in the current 2 years valuation. When we look at the value of all other non-residential property, farmland, utilities, oil and gas production, which makes up 40% of that category, that's not valued on a 24-month window. That's only valued on the 12 months of 2020. So obviously, the recession that we had since March or April is going to have a more adverse impact on that 12-month period. And given that... Amber Alert, okay. I thought Mark was giving me the hook. Give me the hook. And given that we've been in an oil crash for the entirety of 2020, or we expect to, we can expect that all other non-residential property is also going to suffer a 4 to 6% drop. And when you add that to the 4 to 6% drop on top of commercial property, it's probably about a 10% drop. So given a 10% drop in non-residential property over the last 2 years and an all-time record high of residential, we can fully expect Gallagher is again going to mandate that the residential assessment rate goes down, and probably fairly significantly this time, given the combination of the recession and the oil crash. How much will it go down? Well, we don't know because Division of Property Taxation hasn't issued that recommendation yet, but they will next spring. But we can make an educated guess based on what we know of the forecast. If you look at 2019, last year, statewide, non-residential property amounted to $224 billion. And for property tax purposes, non-residential property has an assessed value, a taxable value of about 32% of market value, which amounted to about $73 billion statewide last year. Residential property, by contrast, last year had a market value of $873 billion, and the assessed value of residential property, again, per the Gallagher Amendment, is calculated based on the 55-45 split. So if the assessed value of non-residential in 2019 was $73 billion, Gallagher said the assessed value of residential could only be $62 billion, and to arrive at that number, the assessment rate on houses had to drop from 7.2 to 7.15, which is where we are today. If we apply that same methodology using the forecast we just went through, we're expecting about a 10% drop in non-residential property statewide, maybe down to $200 billion. And at a 32% assessment rate valuation, that puts the assessed value of non-residential at about $64 billion. If you remember, we're expecting an all-time high of residential valuation north of $900 billion. And in order to balance the 55-45, Gallagher will say that the assessed value of residential property can be no more than $52 billion, thereabouts, which means the assessment rate on houses will have to drop from 7.15 to below 6%. That's huge. That's a huge drop. When you compare where we have come from and where we are today, the relative drop in that 19% is pretty significant. The numbers I just went through were just kind of a back-of-the-napkin best guesstimate, but the Division of Property Tax did issue a preliminary estimate in June, and they pegged their number at 5.88. So it's going to be under 6 for sure, and probably 5.8 something. So how will that affect you? Well, it depends on whether you own a house and a business or just a house. It also depends on where you live. More specifically, it depends on how much of your county's tax base to fund local services depends on residential property. The more your county depends on residential property, the more it's going to suffer revenue cuts based on a 19% drop in the residential assessment rate. This chart just shows a sampling of counties across the state, and in the middle column you can see the disparity in how much those different counties depend on residential property for their tax base. Counties like Adams, Chaffee, Elbert, Jefferson, Mesa County depend pretty heavily on residential property, 50% up to almost 70% in Elbert County. Whereas counties like Bent or Weld County depend more on agricultural or oil and gas production. And therefore, the counties that depend most heavily on residential property in the center column will suffer the biggest loss annually in revenue to fund local services by a 19% drop in the residential assessment rate, between 10 to 13%, north of 13% for some. So that drop in revenue that Gallagher is going to mandate by forcing the residential assessment rate down is a permanent cut. Because even though the economy will recover, the residential assessment rate cannot, because Tabor says there has to be a statewide vote of the people, which we've never had. And so counties will be stuck with that lower revenue base. And they'll have three options. Number one, they can permanently reduce services by 10 to 13% just to balance the budget. Number two, they can go to their voters and ask voters to raise the local mill levy just enough to offset the lower residential assessment rate forced by Gallagher. And if you're a homeowner, oftentimes you'll vote for a higher mill levy to sustain local services because it usually doesn't cost you anything. You're paying on more mills, but you're paying a lower assessment rate, right? So it's a trade, and it doesn't cost you anything. But remember that every other class of property is taxed at a fixed rate of 29%. So every time voters vote to raise their local mill levy to offset Gallagher's forced decline in the residential rate, that's a real tax increase for every other class of property. So think of small businesses. They're paying on more mills on the same fixed assessment rate of 29%. So every time we raise the local mill levy, that shifts the tax burden from homeowners to the business community. Third option would be just for local governments is just to kind of cross their fingers and hope that when the economy inevitably recovers, that the underlying market value of houses will grow enough to offset the lower residential assessment rate. And that does happen sometimes in many places that see a lot of growth in market value of residential property, such as the Front Range and the metropolitan area. Unfortunately, it does not happen in the rural areas, and therefore Gallagher quite unintentionally adversely impacts the poorest communities in the state by eroding their tax base when they don't have a corresponding rebound in the growth of the market value. Audience poll. So Every time we vote to raise the mill levy, that shifts the tax burden from homeowners to businesses. In 1982, when we started with Gallagher, for every dollar that homeowners paid in property tax, businesses paid $1.40, okay, on the same value of property. What do businesses pay today for every dollar that homeowners pay on the same value of property? What does business pay? $2, $3, $4, $5, or $6? And most of you said $4, which is right. Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, that's very close. Not only very close, it's almost exact. Because we have already said it twice. They pay 4 times as much, so some of you are paying attention. So this graph, this chart just shows it graphically. In 1983, the year after we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, we set it up where it was a 45-55 split, and for every dollar that homeowners paid in the blue, businesses paid $1.40 with a 21% residential assessment rate. Today, the residential assessment rate has been forced down to 7.15%, which means that for every dollar homeowners pay in the blue, businesses pay little over 4 times as much. If Gallagher forces the residential assessment rate below 6% next year, as everybody expects, for every dollar that homeowners pay, businesses will pay $5. So that shift in the tax burden has been very real and pretty significant, particularly for small businesses. So the lesson that we've learned in all of this is you can't get something for nothing in tax policy. If you have a Gallagher amendment such as we do, the obvious winner in that is homeowners because it continually forces the residential rate lower. The loser in that is local public services providers that depend on that residential tax base to fund services. And I guess the public at large kind of loses to the extent they use those services. Rural communities lose, again, because Gallagher adversely erodes their tax base more than metropolitan areas. Small businesses lose because they're fixed at 29% and the residential rate keeps going down, so the business's share of the tax burden is growing. And the state budget loses because to the extent that the residential tax base shrinks and local school districts are challenged to fund K through 12, the state has a constitutional obligation to step in and backfill. And the state has increased its investment K through 12 by 100%, twice what it was 20 years ago. Because of Gallagher's erosion of the local tax base, which means there's less money in the state budget to pay for everything else, like higher ed and transportation. That's why the state has cut funding for higher ed by half since 2000. And if we pursue a strategy of getting local voters to raise the local mill levy just to sustain funding for the fire district and the library, well, the winner in that is the fire district and the library, local public service providers, because we stabilize their revenue stream by raising the mill levy. And the state budget benefits, because to the extent that we can stabilize local revenue, the state doesn't have to step in and commit more funding to K through 12. But the loser in that, again, is small businesses, because not only do they pay a disproportionate share, but every time we raise the local mill levy, it's a wash for homeowners, but it's a real tax increase for businesses. And rural communities are particularly disadvantaged because they have such a small commercial tax base. You look at some of these rural communities that have one hardware store, one grocery store, one trucking company, one feed co-op, within 60 miles. And every one of those businesses is critical to the economic infrastructure to keep the community running. And if any of those go out of business, it threatens the survivability of all of them. So it particularly puts rural communities in the crosshairs. So in conclusion, Gallagher Amendment will continue to erode the residential assessment rate as it has done for 38 years, as long as residential values continue to outpace non-residential values. And rural communities will continue to quite unintentionally be most adversely impacted by this and see their tax bases erode much faster, particularly rural fire districts. And any effort by any community to get local voters to raise the local mill levy to mitigate that impact will continue that shift in the property tax burden from homeowners to businesses. And because Gallagher is in the Constitution, which we adopted in 1982, if Coloradans want anything different, it's up to them at the ballot to do something, because the legislature can't amend the Constitution. Only the voters can do that. So here's a question for you. This is the first value question. Everything else has been a trivia question. Given that Gallagher has eroded the residential tax rate on houses from 21% in 1982 to 7.15% today, and given that we expect residential values to continue to outpace non-residential and therefore continue to force the residential rate lower, what do you think is the lowest acceptable rate that homeowners should pay in property tax on their house? And our choices are 0, should they be allowed to pay 0 and just shift the whole burden to non-residential owners? 3%, should they be allowed to go that low, which is about half of where we are today? 7.15, which is where we are today, should it not go any lower? Or should they pay something more than they do today? What do you think? There's no right answer to this. I'm just curious what you guys think. And the majority of you said they should pay a higher rate. 3/4 of you said a higher rate. That's interesting. So, Building Better Colorado hosted a statewide conversation on this topic last year when 37 communities, 1,800 community leaders that we specifically targeted. We looked at the Gallagher Amendment. First question we asked is, should we do anything? Are you okay with this? Because if people tell us they're okay with it, we're done. We're not here to sell a solution to a problem they don't think exists. But obviously, over 90% of the people we engaged said this is not sustainable. We've got to do something different. We looked at 4 different policy options, and the most consensus was around the idea of repeal the Gallagher Amendment. We published that report last fall, and as you know, your legislature has now subsequently referred that idea to your ballot with similar bipartisan support as what we saw. In our 1,800 community leaders, almost 3/4 of Democrats, 2/3 of Republicans, and 70% of affiliated voters recommended that. When was the last time you saw that kind of agreement? I'll tell you when the last time you saw it was. It was in the legislature when they referred it, because 3/4 of the legislature similarly embraced that idea in a very strong bipartisan fashion, which rarely happens on tax policy. Right? Am I right? It's true. So it's on your ballot now as Amendment B. It will propose to do 3 things. And incidentally, we're not recommending for or against. We're a non-advocacy. I'm just going to tell you what it does and be happy to answer questions. Number 1, Amendment B would repeal the Gallagher Amendment, which would take that 45-55 frozen ratio of residential to non-residential. It would take it out of the Constitution. It would also repeal the reference to the 21% initial residential rate, which is where we started back in 1983 and from where it's eroded since then. The combination of those 2 word repeals will effectively freeze the residential assessment rate at 7.15% forever. Just like the rate on all other property is frozen at 29%. It would freeze residential at 7.15 unless the voters changed it. Okay? Third, the Amendment B would take all of those assessment rates that I shared with you in that table earlier for all classes of property. It would take all of that out of the Constitution, which means it would only be found in statute, which is the purview of your elected legislature, which means your legislature would then be once again empowered to potentially lower any assessment rate, because that would be in law. They couldn't raise any assessment rate, again, because Tabor says no rate can go up without a statewide vote of the people. But your legislature could potentially lower a rate. So, and finally, just to emphasize, I get this question a lot, well, how's it going to affect the tax rate on my house? Repealing Gallagher doesn't affect the tax rate on anything. On your house or your business or farmland or anything else. All it does is stop the continued formulaic erosion of the residential assessment rate and freezes it at 7.15. So, I know, if you think you understand this, don't try and explain it at the holiday party, because no one will stand by you. Yeah. You'll be a nerd. So I have our website up here. We have a recorded version of this presentation on our website, buildingabettercolorado.org, and I have my email address up here, reeves@betterco.org. Be happy to respond to emails. And Mark, do we have time for questions, or do I sit down?
We've got a poll open for some question and answer.
Okay.
If you want to do that, maybe we could add those questions at the end of the night.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, just really quick, there's a few snacks and drinks in the back. I'm going to take 1 minute, get myself set up. If you want to grab a snack or a drink really quick. Do you see why we asked an expert to come in and explain Amendment B and the Gallagher Amendment? I studied for hours, and I think I understood it, but now I feel like I really understand it. So thank you so much, Reese. We really appreciate it. Amendment B. So a yes on Amendment B would repeal the Gallagher Amendment. A no would leave it in place, okay? You probably got some postcards in the mail that said, it's a $500 million tax hike, right? Anybody else get that postcard, right? Like Reeves said, that is not what it does not affect anything for the coming year. So as we think through our kingdom framework, we don't just want to think about what's best for me personally, like, yay, I pay less in property taxes. We want to think of, like, how do we love our neighbor well? Are our rural schools going to be funded appropriately if we don't do anything? So again, we're not going to tell you how to vote. Reeves did a great job of informing us. I'm going to get set up. If you want to grab a drink, we'll be back in just a minute.
formulaic drop, right? From 7
Yeah.
to 1.5. And some would say that's a tax hike. Not giving you the cut that you would otherwise get is a tax hike. That's where that comes from. I'm not sure I understand that, because under that logic, if stopping a decline is a hike, and we've been raising this antenna, it's not declining anymore. That's my
Do you have the agenda, the times slots? I don't have that with me. Do you have that? Yeah, sorry. Let me grab it. Sorry.
So we're about.
Okay. Okay. Got it. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. We are going to go in order here. So we're going to cover 115, 116, and 118. So the first one in that order is Proposition 115. This is the 22-week abortion ban initiative. Here's the full text of it. I'd encourage you to read through it. Not right now. We're going to try to hurry through some of these. But I encourage you to read through the whole thing. If you have your blue book, you can read all the information about it, all the definitions. What does it mean when we say medically necessary, like life of a mother? What are the caveats there? But just to boil it down, yes and no. A yes vote on Proposition 115 prohibits abortions in Colorado after 22 weeks gestational age, except when an abortion is immediately required to save the life of a pregnant woman. Okay? A no vote on Prop 115 means that abortion in Colorado continues to be legal at any time during a pregnancy. Currently, Colorado is one of the states, I think there's 7 states that allow abortion beyond 22 weeks. So we have people that come to this state from other states in order to do this procedure. So a couple facts about this. Under a Prop 115, abortions may not be performed after 22 weeks of gestational age of the fetus. Measure allows for an exception when, in the reasonable medical judgment of a physician, the pregnant woman's life is threatened by a physical disorder, physical illness, or physical injury, but not including psychological or emotional conditions. So it's not a mental health thing. It is it's a physical disorder, physical illness, or injury. An abortion, rather than an expedited delivery of the living fetus, is immediately required to save the life of a pregnant woman. Okay, so just really quick to help us understand the impact of this, because I think a lot of times our approach, especially in Christian circles, is legislation. And that's not the only approach we can have, right? We can also have policy approaches that try to get at why are people having abortions? How can we address those? Okay, so we have legislative approaches, we have policy approaches. This right here is a legislative approach. We are passing a law that will essentially criminalize abortions. And it only criminalizes it for the doctor who's involved. There's no punishment to the mother involved. Okay, so what impact is this going to have? Well, if we look at it, how many abortions are we talking about? In Colorado, if you look at it by gestational age, 72% of abortions are done from 0 to 8 weeks, okay? 13% 9 to 10, on down. We are talking, at 22 weeks, we are talking about actually 1.9% of all abortions. That's approximately 170 abortions a year in Colorado. Now, probably about half of those are for if you've carried it this long, in most cases, it is a desired pregnancy. Do you understand that? So probably about half of these are for the life of a mother. Several other of them, there's a famous doctor in Boulder who does these, and it is if the fetus is not viable. Okay. Now, there have been instances where a doctor convinces a mother to carry it to term, even in that situation, and the diagnosis is wrong. Okay, that happens. But when we look at this, the viability of the fetus is not part of this. Do you understand that? Okay, it's just the life of the mother. It's not the life of the fetus. Okay, so what that doctor in Boulder does, his practice that he's semi-famous for, that people fly from New York to have this procedure done, that essentially all goes away. Okay, so we are talking at this gestational age, we're talking about 170 abortions, but really maybe 80 or so abortions a year that we're stopping out of the several thousands that are happening in Colorado per year. This is not a contradiction to Roe v. Wade. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade allows abortions or gives women a right to abortion up to the age of viability. And at that point, the Supreme Court said, we're not going to decide what the age of viability is. And so it is left essentially up to the states. What Colorado is doing is saying the age of viability is about 22 weeks, and so we are going to restrict it beyond that. Okay? That is Proposition 115. We have questions. As we go through these, feel free to throw questions up here. But Blythe, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. First of all, did I miss anything? You work with, like Bobby mentioned, you work with James Coleman, who's a Democrat. Can you kind of share your perspective on Prop 115?
Yeah, I thought you explained it really well. This is, let me start by saying, yes, I'm Chief of Staff for Representative James Coleman, who is also running for Senate in Senate District 33, if anyone is in his district, little plug. So I'll make very clear kind of our office's view and position, and then we'll distinguish if where I differ from that. And I think this is a really good opportunity to talk about how polarized our political culture is and how I have been called things and assumptions made about me for working for a Democrat, when in reality this, as has already been alluded to, this is such a complex, nuanced topic, nationally, locally, personally, for women and men, and it is harmful to our country, and especially to the church and the witness of the church, when we engage in this topic like it is a simple black and white topic without real people involved. And I have seen in my personal life, choosing to love and walk with people in tough situations, and then through my job on a policy side, have seen the complexity and the nuance in this topic. And as was already alluded to, there's a legislative way to address this, and then more of a policy way. That's kind of how you framed it, right? And I think that's a really wise way to frame it. So my boss, James Coleman, our office's position is that the legislating to make abortion illegal and focusing on that is not the most effective way to actually reduce abortions. Our office focuses on policy changes, healthcare for the mother, sex education. And Colorado actually has one of the best programs in the country for sex education, and it's actually dramatically reduced unplanned pregnancies in our state in the past 5 to 10 years, which is wonderful. So our office's official position is we focus on policy solutions to some of these complex issues. What are the root issues that are leading women to get abortions? It is not this black and white. I think, again, some of this really unhelpful. Our culture is so polarized. We have two parties who are primarily kind of dictated. Their positions are dictated by some wealthy funders on both sides who try to simplify this issue and make it less nuanced than it really is. In reality, there's a lot of different root issues that affect what is leading women to this position where they're considering an abortion. And so our office focuses on what are those root issues and how can we address those, rather than just legislating end abortion. Because if we're not also addressing those root issues, and there's data and statistics on this, that abortions actually will not decrease that much if we're just focusing on legislating versus policy decisions. So I will say Representative Coleman's office does not support would official position is voting no on this initiative. Personally, I differ from that. I agree. I think you can vote yes on this, and while also working for policy changes. And I think there's room for that, and there's room for nuance. And I'm thankful to, again, it's a really wonderful thing to work for a boss who is a believer and who gets that there is nuance and who wants to surround himself with people who disagree and who push and challenge. And I'm not going to speak for him personally, but as far as our office and the current political climate we're in, he values having people around him who provide different perspective and challenge and encourage him. And I feel very called to be in this position, to be able to provide a very minority voice in the environment I'm in, and that you can do both. We can recognize that, personally speaking, abortion is not what's best for the life of a child or a mother. But there are very real reasons why these women are there. And so let's address those reasons at the same time. And I want to add, providing that perspective from our office. I will say we have heard the stories of the small number of women who, they have medical conditions that aren't necessarily urgently life-threatening, but that do affect their health and well-being. Their child has been given a diagnosis that they feel would lower the quality of life. So we hear these stories. They're heartbreaking. They're hard stories. Our office feels, the official position of our office is that there's not, the way this amendment is worded, is that it does not legally leave enough room for the woman to legally make a decision that she feels is best for her body. And so that is that argument, and why people want to know on this is because, hey, there's not legally enough room in this amendment to leave a woman with choice in a very hard, difficult situation. Again, personally, I think there is enough room legally, and there are lawyers on both sides who will argue that until they're blue in the face. So that's kind of where each person does need to look at the facts and pray through it.
Yeah, and I think we tend to, fall into the whole single issue voting, especially with this one. And what we see is, this is the biggest reason for voting for president that a lot of people think of, right? Anytime you talk about it or even offer an alternative, the immediate response is abortion. And the reality is that it doesn't really matter who the president is. Abortions declined under Barack Obama. They declined under Bill Clinton. They're actually at their lowest levels since Roe v. Wade. They are lower than they were when Roe v. Wade was passed. In Colorado, they've been decreasing. They actually started ticking up the past couple years. The number of chemical abortions is much higher by percentage than it was before. There are different methods that people are looking to. So when we look specifically at Prop 115, we want our laws to match our morality, right? We want our laws to essentially lay out, here's what we believe about morality. At the same time, we understand that laws don't really have a lot of power to change behavior in most cases, right? We had the whole war on drugs, the crime bill from the 90s, which was a disaster. And what did it highlight? We are going to, heighten sentencing laws. We're going to do all this to punish more. And did it work? So when we look at legislating, we want our laws to match our morality. And if we believe that a child in the womb is a human person, then we want laws that will protect it, right? At the same time, we also want to be working towards actually reducing the number of those deaths. And whether or not this is, like I said, this is probably going to affect about 80 cases a year, best case. All right. Is it a good thing? Sure. Like 80 kids, that's great. Is it going to make the most impact out of all the things that we can do? I'm not telling you how to vote. Like there are a couple options here. I want you to understand what the impact of your vote will have, and also encourage you, if we believe that children in the womb should be protected, let's let's be pursuing some policy options as well that we really think will help to reduce the abortion rate in ways that laws maybe can't. Okay, we got one question. Is it detrimental to legislate without equal work toward policy changes to address root issues? Blythe, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, personally, I believe yes. I think it is. Trying to be careful how much to tell. I have had this conversation a lot. And I'm studying a lot of this for my master's. I've done a lot of this for my job. I do, based on the evidence and the data we have, if we were hypothetically to say, to try to pass, there's so much that goes into it. Nationally, Roe v. Wade will never be overturned. It'll just be based on states. But if we had, in Colorado, for example, if our state decided to completely outlaw abortion, without simultaneously addressing the root issues of, it's something like 75 to 80% of women who are seeking abortions are seeking them for economic or domestic violence, domestic abuse situations. So if we were to simply outlaw abortion without also addressing those things, I highly suspect we would see post children outside the womb. I think we would see infant mortality rates rising exponentially. I think we would see just different issues related to domestic abuse, poverty. I think the number of kids entering our foster care system would increase exponentially, and our foster care system is already incredibly underfunded, undersupported, even by the church. So I think unless people are willing to, I suspect from some of the conversation around this year that voting for anti-abortion laws is an easy thing to do. Being willing to do the hard, thoughtful, nuanced work of what is actually gonna help save the most lives, both children and women, that is harder, and that requires a lot of thought and time, and it requires work, stepping outside our comfort zones, getting to know people, walking with them, figuring out how to best love them, getting involved in our foster care system and family reunification and what's going on with moms and dads, and that's harder. And so in my conversations with people, I always encourage definitely find out what are these root causes, how can we be involved in those now. And I think we'll continue to, and the church is already doing this in a lot of ways. There's a lot of good things going on, and I think that's why we're seeing the abortion rate decline continually, progressively. But yes, I think my prediction would be that if we only focused on outlawing abortion, not just this law, but more dramatic laws, without addressing the root issues in other policy ways, healthcare, education, job training, childcare help for single moms, stuff like that, we would see an increase in our already overwhelmed social services. We'd see an increase in infant mortality.
Great. Next question. Wouldn't funded adoption be a much more workable option? Again, this is one of those legislative approach versus policy approach, and funding adoption is a policy option, and that would be a great thing. It's not on the ballot right now, right? And then finally, is this proposition functionally a stepping stone to more restrictive legislation in the future? It can't really, because otherwise you run into the restrictions given in Roe v. Wade. So you would have to eliminate Roe v. Wade, which is very unlikely to happen even if we get enough Supreme Court justices. So at this point, this is essentially kind of the best we can do within the Roe v. Wade framework. We have other options besides just legislation. All right, we do need to move on. If you have more questions, please save them for the end. Our next one is Proposition 116, a state income tax rate reduction. So Proposition 116 is actually really simple. Shall there be a change to the Colorado revised statutes reducing the state income tax rate from 4.63% to 4.55%? So like Reeves was saying on the Gallagher Amendment, that is not changing your tax rate. This one is changing your income tax rate, okay? So yes would change it, and no obviously would not. What is the impact here? So the general fund revenue sources for the state, individual income tax. So this is just the general fund. Individual income tax, and I went to the legislative website. You can go and look at all of their whole breakdown. I had to actually add this up because they didn't give you like a table output. Individual income tax makes up 57% of our general fund revenue in the state of Colorado. So 57% is coming from that individual income tax. The spending, here's how we actually spend out of that general fund. And some of this is different than just the property tax spending. Education is at, 21%, healthcare 19%. Human services, 15. That's like, we do foster care. We have a lot of foster care families. Human services is there. Higher education, transportation. Reeves talked about all of these things that, we're having to pull funding in order to fund schools. And even there, our schools are towards the bottom of the nation when it comes to funding. Okay, so what would a cut like this mean? All right, so here's essentially what would happen to you based on so you can try to see where approximately your taxable income is, right? If you're making $50,000 currently, you at 4.63%, you would be paying $2,315 annually in your income taxes. If we pass this, you would save a whopping $40 a year on your taxes. If you're making, if you're making a lot of money, if you're making six figures, you could save $100. If you're making $1 million, you would save $800 a year. That would have a lot of impacts across all of these services, though. When you add it up, it feels, almost comic. Like I would save, I don't know, I don't even want to say, but it's under $100. Let's put it that way, is how much I personally would save. But here are some of the cuts that we would see if we were to do that. So you can see it would make a significant difference to our schools, to healthcare, human services, higher education, transportation, things like that. When you add it up across all of the people that are working in the state of Colorado, and you take that $40, $50, $60 a year savings that you're getting, it adds up, all right? If you're the libertarian type and you think all tax is theft, and you think that the government only mismanages money, I can understand, like taking money away from the government. Maybe that fits into that mindset. If you are on the other side and you feel like government services are really helpful, or your kids go to a public school, or you interact with human services a lot. We work with caseworkers who are overworked and underpaid. Here are the kind of reductions that they will see. All right, so Proposition 116, it's a really simple one on the face of it. It's basically asking you, do you want a little bit of a tax cut to save some money each year? Blythe, anything I missed there, or
No, that
what's
was
your
real
take
good.
on it? And if anybody has questions, throw them out there.
No, you explained that really well. I mean, our office's position is a very hard no on this. I think it's pretty obvious why. Reeves explained it really well, but definitely open to any questions about it. I mean, the basic numbers are the average of us will get between $35 and $40 back a year.
Yeah.
And 70% of the people who will get more than that are the most wealthy and large businesses, not even small businesses. It's large businesses and the most wealthy in our state.
So the first question, why is this being proposed? We're in a recession and people are anxious to save their own money, right? At the same time, because we're in a recession, state funding is also down a lot. So everybody is hurting for money right now. So essentially, I think the idea was anything we can do to put more money into the pockets of the citizens could be a good thing. That is my understanding of why this is being proposed. Given that our current flat income tax rate represents a heavier burden on poorer taxpayers because they have less discretionary income, wouldn't it be more morally appropriate to adopt a progressive tax rate? Instead of just a flat rate, have a progressive tax rate that increases with wealth. Maybe. Honestly, that's not on the ballot, and we're short on time. It was mentioned earlier that tax increases basically never pass in Colorado. Have any cuts passed? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer. Reeves, do you know the answer? 2 cuts?
Yeah, in I think 99 and 2000, we lowered the state income tax rate from 5% to 5.75, and then to current, or to 4.75, and then to the current 4.63.
Yeah.
This would be the 3rd time in 2 decades.
And with Tabor, we've never increased it.
Right, and what prompted those 2 cuts in 99 and 2000 was such a boom, economic boom, because of the advent of the internet in the 90s. The state had so much money because Tabor was having to write refund checks.
Yeah.
They were trying to reduce the amount of money coming to the state.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I'll add too is that 116 and 117, 117 is similar, slightly sneakily worded amendment. Both of those are funded and being pushed by out-of-state special interests who have connections to big businesses here in Colorado. So that is important to know if you do some research on both 116 and 117. They're primarily backed and funded by out-of-state special interests who have business interests here in Colorado.
Yeah, and I would encourage you can go to ballotpedia.org. You can look up who is paying for these, who has donated money to each of these on, the for and against. And it's really interesting to see where the money's coming from and how they're spending it. All right, that was a really simple one. There's not a whole lot to it. Do you want to take a little bit of extra money and see those cuts across the state? Next one. Proposition 118. This is the Paid Family and Medical Leave Insurance Program. All right, so here's the full text. I'm not going to read it. I encourage you to go to your Blue Book or to your ballot and read it. Here's essentially what it'll do. It'll create a paid family and medical leave insurance program for Colorado employees administered by the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. It'll require employers and employees in Colorado to pay a payroll premium to finance paid family and medical leave insurance benefits beginning January 1st, 2023, okay? The dates here are key, okay? Because it feels like, oh, if we vote yes, tomorrow I'm going to lose some out of my paycheck. We essentially have 2 years, a little over 2 years to prepare if it is passed, okay? Allow eligible employees up to 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave insurance benefits annually beginning January 1st, 2024. That means that we are paying into it for a year and funding it before it actually goes into place. I have a whole timeline. I should say that for that. Create job protections for employees who take paid family and medical leave. All right, so what are the details? What does it mean to take leave? What are the qualified reasons to take leave under this? To care for their own serious health condition, to care for a new child during the first year after the birth, adoption, or placement through foster care of that child. I'm trying not to be selfish here. To care for a family member with a serious health condition. When a family member is on active duty military service or being called to active duty military service. When the individual or the individual's family member is a victim of domestic violence, stalking, or sexual assault. And there are definitions to those. It can't just be, I think somebody's stalking me, I need 12 weeks off. Right? There are actual criminal codes around what stalking means. Right? You can go into the definitions and look at those. All right. Like I said, there's a timeline. If it's enacted, the fund is created. January 22, rules and regulations are adopted. July 22, outreach services begin to educate the public about the program. Employers and employees begin paying premiums January 2023. We'll talk about what those premiums would be for you. And then January 24, employees may begin to take paid leave. 2025, the maximum weekly benefit changes from $1,100 to 90% of the state's average weekly wages. The calculations here, like the math here, is kind of complicated, okay? I don't know if I'll be able to explain it super well, but here's essentially what some scenarios are, right? If your weekly wages are $500, your employer weekly premium is $225, employee weekly premium is $225. That means you would have annual wages of $26,000. Your annual, like this is what it would cost annually. For you, it would be $117. For your employer, it would be $117. You can see all the way down how much it's costing, right? If you make $3,000 a week, that's a little over $150,000 a year. It would cost you a little over $700, your employer a little over $700 to pay into this fund. And again, this is everybody that's working. This is not if you yourself are wanting paid medical and family leave. This is everybody pays into it, and then the people that need it, they're able to use it. All right. Here's the benefit payment scenario. So how much money can I get if I have to take leave, right? If I'm making $500, my max weekly benefit is $450. That is 90% of my average weekly wages. And it's because there's a whole calculation to it. If you're below 50% of the state average weekly wages, you can take up to 90%. Anything above 50% of the state average weekly wages, you could take 50%. That's why you can see it decreases the farther you go down. If you're making a lot of money, you can't, you get capped out at $1,100 in 2024. It will go up in 2025 potentially, but it'll essentially be capped around $1,340, $1,340. Okay, so if you look at that, how much do you make per week? How much could you take from this program if you had to take medical leave, right? If you make $1,000 a week, you could, if you had a baby, if you took a foster kid, if you had serious illness or had to care for a loved one with serious illness, you could take $768 a week if you were making $1,000 a week. Okay, that's how much you would be paid, and you would also have the job protections that say when you come back, you have to come back to a similar position. You cannot, you can't come back and they say, oh, so-and-so's doing your job now, you can have this other job where, it pays less and it's kind of a demotion, but you have your job back. You're not allowed to do that. It has to be a similar job with the same pay, same rank, okay? We're going to have a lot of questions. Blythe, you want to jump in while people are putting questions in?
Oh, it's a great explanation. Yeah, I think, I'll say our office's position is definitely very strongly for this. You talk about being, and I fully agree, being pro-family, pro-life. I think this is one of the most basic things to consider, and totally understand there are, small business considerations. There are protections in this, the way this is written for small businesses, not having to protect them, to not have to pay into it if they're below a certain size. So
if you're less, if you're less than 10 employees, you're exempt. Also, really quick, if your company already has a family medical leave program, you're exempt. I know a few of you have this where you can take time off if you have a kid, if you have a foster placement. If your company already has an insurance program for that, they're exempt. Local governments for their employees can opt out of it, but employees themselves can opt into it, right? If your employer is exempt, or if you're in a business that's less than 9 or less than 10, you can opt into it and just pay the employee portion. Your employer does not have to.
Yeah, and I think we can't talk about, going back to the abortion question, I don't think we can talk about that without also considering, I have a personal relationship with someone who, this was years ago, who this was her reason for, I cannot have a baby right now because I have to work. I have to work to feed my other 3 children, and I work at a minimum wage job. I have no vacation. I cannot have this baby and provide and so it's things like this that are so crucial for infant and maternal welfare, for really saving lives. Those of us who have kids know that bonding to set up a child for success their whole life. So much of it happens in the first 12 weeks. There's just a lot of reasons to be for this, even if there might be some kinks to work out for businesses.
Yeah, so a lot of the opposition to this is it is a cost to doing business in Colorado, right? And a cost to doing small business in Colorado. If you have a business with 12 employees, your margins might not be that big, this could be difficult to accommodate. So there are arguments on both sides. I want you to just understand what it's going to do. All right. A couple questions. How does the cost compare with short-term disability insurance? Is the proposition mostly about the protections of job preservation? I wouldn't say it's mostly about that. I mean, it's mostly about creating this fund that people can then use. But how do the costs compare with short-term disability insurance? I don't know, so I'm not going to speculate. But essentially, this is saying everybody has to do it. You can't just, hope that your business does it if you're in this situation, right? So I don't know what the costs are. Again, if you already have insurance like this, family medical leave as a company, like if you're like, I'm going to take care of my employees, I'm going to pay the cost of this, I'm going to pay the premiums for this, you're exempt. Like you get to keep that. You don't have to worry about it as long as they're at a minimum doing this much, right? How often can one use this medical leave? You can use it, correct me if I'm wrong, 12 weeks 12 weeks annually, right? So if you have a baby, you can take 12 weeks. If you have a serious illness, you need to take 6 weeks, and then you're better, and then it comes back. You can take 6 more weeks, but you are capped at 12 weeks annually. Does this add any additional job protections under FMLA, or does that stay the same? And is this for the paid support during the leave? Oh, yes. If you look in your Blue Book, there's actually a chart that compares. So Colorado actually passed a law, the Family Medical Leave, I forget what the A stands for. FMLA. So there's actually a chart that breaks down what the difference is, and it's in your Blue Book on page 56. What this expands, what the difference is between the existing law. So FMLA does have some job protections in place. I don't know specifically what they are. I can't necessarily speak to that. So I don't know if this increases or decreases that. I don't know if, do you know that?
I don't. I think I think it just offers the same amount of job protection. Like you can't lose your job for taking this leave. And that's what FMLA does. So
Yeah.
I don't think it adds anything additional.
Yeah. The only thing that I can think of is it really specifies it has to be the same rank, the same pay. It cannot in any way be a demotion, right? So it gets really explicit about that. But I don't know how that compares to FMLA. What will happen to the state plan if a majority of businesses, has this been done in any other states? Yes. I forget which ones, but I think that's in the Blue Book.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember too. I think it's New Jersey, I think. But this has been done successfully. I think it's 2 or 3 other states have fully a similar type of mandate or law, and it's very successful. So.
Yeah. What will happen to the state plan if a majority of businesses just provide their own coverage and therefore not paying? Well, it would only cover the people that are paying in that situation, right? So if that pool shrinks down until every business is like, well, it's just cheaper for us to get insurance, then we could potentially be at a point where we don't need this anymore. We are nowhere near that. So I don't think that is a live concern necessarily. Does this apply to any employee, employer? Are there restrictions based on immigration status or anything else? That is a good question.
I don't think it mentions that.
I don't think either. I think if you're paying into it, you can take the benefit.
Yeah, I think it just falls under the other legal status, the other laws we already have in Colorado as far as hiring based on legal status, and I think it already falls under those laws. So under current law in Colorado, most jobs require, most businesses that would have this are businesses, companies that would require proof of citizenship. So I don't think this specifically addresses it, but it would, I think, would be addressed through current law in Colorado.
Yeah, I don't know that the employer includes a person who acts directly or indirectly in the interest of an employer with regard to any of the employees of the employer. a successor in interest of an employer that acquires all of the organization, trade, or business, substantially all the assets of one or more employees and the state or a political subdivision of the state. Those are the definitions it gives for employee. So I would say I would agree with Blythe there. Yeah. What else? Any idea about how businesses feel about this? I don't personally. So I will say the polling for this. This one is the if you look at the polls, and these are from earlier in October. This was far and away the most popular of these. Something like 57% support to 21% against, with 22% undecided. So, like from a community perspective, it appears this is something that's incredibly popular. As far as businesses go, I mean, it depends on the business. If a business is running on really thin margins. Whenever we have these, we did this 4 years ago, and one of the propositions on the ballot was to raise the minimum wage to, I think at the time was $15, right? And one of the big objections was, I run a small business, I employ high schoolers or college students. I can't run my small business if I have to pay them $15 an hour, right? So for a lot of businesses, the bottom line is a significant concern. The question is, how do we want to organize businesses in our society? What do we want to provide to workers? What rights do we want our workers to have? What rights do we want our businesses to have? So I don't know. Blythe, do you have any insight into that, like as far as businesses go, what their take on this one is?
Yeah, I mean, there are, again, I think just the common good mindset of this is what is truly best for kids and families in the long run, and I mean, this will lead to jobs, employee stability. I mean, employees staying around long term. You provide benefits. I mean, there are a few companies in the U.S. that already provide benefits like this. I think Patagonia is one of them, and they have something like literally 100% employee retention over 10 years. I mean, it's the statistics for retaining good quality employees over the long term because of policies like this. I mean, that's good for your business, and that's what I meant by, I know there are some kinks. And this was a big objection. I mean, the legislature this past year tried to pass a version of this, and the main objections were from small businesses who were like, this will kill us. Like, we cannot do this. And we get that. And I mean, there's a lot, my boss being one of them, very pro small business Democrats who were not in favor of the bill as it was written in the legislature, and that's one of the reasons it didn't end up passing or going through. So we are very sympathetic and totally understand that. Small business owners especially, this is a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, but I mean, there's a reason every single other developed nation in our world has not even this, a year, more than this, and it works, and it's successful. And the U.S. has the highest infant and maternal mortality rate of any developed nation by far. And there's a correlation, there's a reason. And so the more it becomes part of our culture and the norm, the easier it will be for businesses. There's so much compassion and sympathy for working those kinks out, especially for small businesses who need to figure out how this will look, but truly believe that in the long run, this is what is best for our country as a whole, for businesses and for families. And just kind of, and that's where I think this ballot measure really is trying to consider, how can we make this transition as easy as possible for small businesses? And this is better than it was when the legislature was trying to pass it this past year. So they are really trying to think about how to make this as easy a transition as possible for small businesses. But I mean, bottom line, like it will probably take a couple years of figuring out how to do this well, and putting families and children above the bottom line for some businesses for a few years, until it becomes a normal part of our culture and our economy and our way of doing things.
Yeah. So thinking through a lot of things, there's good reasons. You might be in favor of this and still say, I don't think this is the best way to implement it, right? You might be in favor of this and think this would actually work better at a federal level than a state level, okay? So when we think about these things, like it's very easy for us to prioritize what is the bottom line, right? Who's making money, who's losing money, as opposed to what is going to contribute to flourishing in our communities, right? And so, like, think about that when you go to vote for this. And it's legitimate to think, I like this idea. I don't think this plan is feasible. Let's start working towards something better. But here's a start. Here's a proposal that somebody came up with. It gives businesses 2 years in advance to figure it out, to start planning for it and preparing for it, getting their workforce ready for it. So that is Proposition 118. Let's see. Can this be used in addition to companies' short-term disability programs? I don't know. I don't know that it specifies this. If they have an FMLA program, like FMLA insurance, then that matches this, then they are exempt from this program. They don't need to use it. So I don't know that you could use them in combination unless your existing did not provide much. I would think so. Like if your company has Aflac or something like that, with the duck guy, and you're getting benefits from that aren't necessarily, a full FMLA insurance, I would think you could, but I actually don't know.
Yeah, anyone who does, those have the short-term disability, like for pregnancy, for example, is like you're not paid your full salary. It's a shorter amount of, so I think that's a totally different thing that I think companies can still offer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I don't like this, want something similar or better, how do I advocate? Try to get your employer to provide it. There's other things you can come up with your own proposition if you want and try to get it on the ballot. There's a lot of different avenues you can take. What would this affect what insurance employees offer to their employees? Not direct, like there's nothing in this that would affect that. Potentially, if an employer looks at this and says, I've got this added cost for the FMLA program, I'm going to have to reduce insurance benefits to compensate. There could be ramifications like that, but there's nothing directly in the bill that dictates any of that, right? It's like Obama saying, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. What he meant, the ACA says nothing about who you can go see, but there's ramifications to the policy that sometimes are not necessarily intended. Okay, so I think that's the best we can offer there.
And I would just add to that question about if you want something different or better, reach out to your state representative. I work in that office. They listen. They really do. And especially if you have enough voices who are really pushing for something and demanding it, your state representative will listen and help you get it on the ballot next time or run a bill for it. Or, especially if you, again, there's power in numbers. You get a group together and you're raising your voice enough about it and make it clear that if they don't do something, you will not vote for them next time. They really, especially our state representatives, the elections are often so close for state representatives. They really do listen to stuff like this. If you have an idea, ask to meet with someone and talk about it. Ask to meet with your representative or a policy expert in a certain area and talk about it and come up with an idea and run it by someone.
Yeah. Go work with Build a Better Colorado. Come up with some proposals, right? We've got about 20 minutes left. We're going to put a survey up here where you can choose which of the propositions you would like to cover. So we have time for one more. We decided not to rank the remaining one. We're going to let you choose which one we cover next. I have my guess. We'll see. Don't do the wolves, please. That is the one that I'm least informed on. You're going to do the wolves just for that, aren't you? Yeah, sorry, this is... No, you're good, you're good. There is, yeah. So we're going to give the people that are on the live stream a chance to vote as well. And it takes, it is weird if you watch this. There's about a 30-second delay. I should have prepared a commercial here, right?
We can do a check-in on the current presidential debate.
We could, yeah.
I don't think I want to.
I don't either. Sorry, yeah. We're not going to talk candidates, guys. That's not what we're doing today. I think I was right. Okay, it's not really close. We good? Everybody feel? Okay. I knew you were going to pick this one. I should prepare some slides for it. Proposition 113. As soon as we talked about it, I'm like, I know what they're going to pick. Adopt agreement to elect U.S. president by national popular vote. And honestly, we could talk for a long time about this. Okay, so shall the following act of the General Assembly be approved? An act concerning adoption of an agreement among the states to elect the President of the United States by national popular vote, being Senate Bill number 19-042. A yes vote approves a bill that's already been passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, joining Colorado and other states as part of an agreement to elect the President of the United States by national popular vote if enough states enter the agreement. Okay, in order to be elected president, you need 270 electoral votes. If this coalition, the National Popular Vote Coalition, can get enough states to be up to agree to this, that they exceed 270 or meet at least 270 electoral votes, then this goes into place. Until then, a no vote on Prop 113, but essentially, like, even if you vote yes, it's not going to happen until we get enough states. No vote rejects the bill and basically just keeps everything the same. Okay, what does that mean? Does anybody know why we have the Electoral College? Why do we have the Electoral College? We don't directly, Reeves, I know you know. Why do we have the Electoral College? Anybody? No. Okay. When the founders met, Constitutional Convention 1787, right? They have to decide how are we going to elect a president, and part of the discussion is let's just do a popular vote, right? Just every other office is a popular vote. Let's just do a popular vote. There were a few concerns about a popular vote. One, it was a collection of colonies, and it was very hard to be known nationally unless your name was George Washington, right? Out of all the elections, only 2 of them had 100% support for one candidate, and that was George Washington twice, okay? So they're concerned, how can one person gain enough national notoriety to get enough of the vote? And their concern was they wanted whoever wins to have a majority of the vote, not just a plurality of the vote. Okay, so you understand the difference between a majority and a plurality. Majority is over 50%. Plurality could be less than 50%, but it's whoever gets the most votes, right? Last election, I think Hillary Clinton got 46%, Donald Trump got 43%. My numbers might be kind of off, right? That's a plurality. That's actually, Hillary Clinton had the plurality in that situation, right? So nobody got over 50% in that election. Nobody had a majority. So the founders, they want somebody to have a majority, but they don't think somebody can be famous enough across, there's no telegrams, there's no internet, there's no TV. How does one person actually get their message across the whole United States? So they develop a system where the states choose electors. And if you read the federal papers, like Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers about why they wanted to do this, he also gets into, you can't quite trust the electorate to be swayed by somebody who's essentially a madman. We need them to select wise men as their electors who will then go ahead and choose the president. Okay, so they come up with this system, the Electoral College. Every state gets a proportional number of electors, and that number of electors is based on House of Representatives and senators. Like your full representation in the legislature, that's how many electors you get, right? So big states, they've got a bunch of representatives and they've got 2 senators. Really small states, they've got 1 representative and they've got 2 senators, they've got 3 electoral votes, right? The other concern, and this gets a little bit awkward when we talk about American history. The southern states have large populations, but small voter numbers, right? You understand why? Okay, a lot of white slave owners, or not a lot of white slave owners, a lot of slaves. They want representation, they want power in Congress, but they don't necessarily want their slaves to vote. So what ends up happening? 3/5 compromise. We are going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation. So now these wealthy white slave owners, there's only a few of them, they've got a lot of electoral votes. In fact, in the first 10 elections, I think 7 of them were from Virginia, okay, which is one of the highest slave-owning states, right? It gives them disproportionate powers because a small number of voters has a large number of electors, okay? So 1787, we implement this system. It goes off the rails almost immediately, okay? You get to the election of 1800, and if you're familiar with Hamilton, right, the musical, there's this whole piece about the election of 1800, and Jefferson or Burr, you know, there's a whole song, Jefferson or Burr, what are we going to do? And it sounds like Jefferson and Burr are running against each other. Jefferson and Burr were actually running mates, and it was the Democratic Republicans that messed up their votes so that Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson tied the election. And it gets into just the weirdness of how the Electoral College works. 1803, they come back, they're like, we can't have that again. We almost gave the election to somebody who wasn't supposed to win. And so they reorganize the Electoral College. In every state, so essentially the Electoral College leaves it up to the state to determine how are they going to designate their electors, right? So when we talk about this agreement, if you think this is unconstitutional, it's not. It is up to the state to determine how are they going to designate their electors. Any states can do whatever they want. And at the beginning, all the states were doing something different. Some states would just have their legislature choose the electors. There was no popular vote for president in some states. It was just the legislature would choose who would be president. Other states, they would have a popular vote. Every state that did a popular vote required a majority to win. You could not win the state without a majority, and they would set up like runoffs and stuff like that. So you had to get over 50%. The other thing is, when the electors actually show up and they cast their ballots for the president, the winner has to get a majority of electors. If they don't, then it goes to the House of Representatives. That's where you have the Jefferson or Burr, right? Because they tied, and so it went to the House of Representatives, it's super interesting, was actually run by the Federalists, who were all lame ducks because they'd all lost, because now the Democratic Republicans are coming into power. And so the Federalists are in the position where they get to choose which of the Democratic Republicans they want to be president, and that's where it just goes completely off the rails. You think this can't happen. It almost happened with George Wallace running against Humphreys and Nixon. George Wallace just enters as a spoiler, and his whole goal was to throw the whole system into chaos so that he can take enough electoral votes that nobody gets a majority, and the whole thing ends up going to Congress, where Southern senators can have a stalemate. James Madison in the 1800s tried to propose an amendment. We just need a popular vote. In the 1800s, James Madison, father of the Constitution, we just need a popular vote. In the 60s, after that election with Nixon, there was a movement to move to a popular vote. And it had a lot of support. It went through the House of Representatives, went to the Senate, and it would have had the support to pass it, but it got filibustered by Southern senators because they liked their disproportionate power, right? If you have a state where you have either a lower population, you have disproportionate power. If you have a state where maybe there's a large population, but you're able to suppress the vote of certain voters, that gives that small percentage of people in that state a lot of electoral power. Okay, so when we talk about it, you'll see this map all the time, right? County level results of the election from 2016. I think this is hanging in. This is the one that's hanging in the White House, right? It looks like it's a landslide, right? Just looking at it, there's a lot of red there. The problem with that is the blue is actually where people live, right? If we actually do it by population, it looks a lot different. One of the complaints against the national popular vote is that, it'll give Texas and California and Florida, disproportionate power. It's actually the opposite, okay? Because here's what happens. If you have a large state, so, you've got, these are the states by population. Here's the number of electoral votes that they have, all right? In 2016, how many times do you think presidential candidates visited California, the one state with the highest number of electoral votes? How many times did Trump or Clinton visit California? You're close. They visited it one time. How many times did they visit Texas? One time. Do candidates have to care about the safe states? No, they don't. Why? Because they are reliably blue or red, and it just doesn't matter. But Florida could go either way. So what happens? You have 71 candidate visits in Florida. Pennsylvania has 54. Arizona, 11. California has 5 times as many electoral votes. Arizona has 11. They had 10 presidential candidate visits during the 2016 election. Why? Because they could be flipped, all right? So what candidates are incentivized to prioritize swing states, which means that states like Colorado, where Biden has, depending on the poll you look at, either a 10 or 18-point lead, nobody comes to Colorado, right? They don't need our votes. But what if you're a Republican in Colorado and you want your vote to matter? Too bad. It's winner take all, right? The founders didn't intend a winner-take-all system. They left it to the states to decide, but they didn't see it happening as a winner-take-all system. You could change the Electoral College and say, we're going to do it by district. This is Madison's idea. We can do it by district, and then different districts within the state can have different electors. And that way, Colorado, I think, has 9 electoral votes. And so, 6 of them could go to the Democrat, 3 of them could go to the Republican, and people in different districts can feel like their vote matters. In a national popular vote, now you're incentivized to go to California because you might not win the state, but you'll win a lot of voters in the state, and that actually matters. Same with, some of the lower ones. If you look at the numbers, it's really interesting, the western states, huge state, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota. Why do we have 2 Dakotas? Right? You know why? Because the Republicans wanted more electoral votes when it was time to bring states into statehood. If they separated them into 2 states, guess what? That's 6 electoral votes instead of 3. And they're safe Republican votes, right? It's essential, like the Electoral College and the way we've brought in states, it's essentially gerrymandering across the nation. Okay, so all of that to say, the system that we have is not what the founders intended. That is not telling you how to vote on this, because you can believe that, but also say a national popular vote isn't a better way, okay? Or this compact, wouldn't it be better to, amend the Constitution and actually fix it instead of every state having to enter into a compact where they agree that, once we get to 270, then we're just going to cast our electors regardless of, our Colorado voters, even if Colorado voted for, and again, this is not going to happen this election. This has no impact on this election whatsoever. But if all the Colorado voters wanted Biden, but the national popular vote wanted Trump, then Colorado's electors would have to go for Biden, right? That's essentially what we're saying. So, Electoral College, if you think that this was like some genius invention of the founders, it is not, what we have right now is not what the founders intended. And in fact, many of the founders looked at it and said, oh man, we messed up, we need to fix this, okay? But you can come to this and say a national popular vote might not be the best option to fix it, okay? Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Blythe, anything to add there? Is anybody funding? There's a National Popular Vote Coalition that's like a nationwide organization that's working towards this, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of support from a lot of different progressive groups here in Colorado, but yeah, I think it's the National Coalition who's funding this, trying to push this in a lot of states. Yeah. You can Google that because I don't know the exact.
Ballotpedia will tell you exactly who is doing the funding. I will say in the polling, this was the closest. 39 yes, 38 no, 23 undecided as far as percentages. I don't think so. No.
No, it won't affect this election.
Like we are looking at like at least 2 elections down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I really try to intentionally listen to all sides of these different conversations, because all of these issues are more complex than our very politicized soundbite culture wants us to know. The main argument, I am very much for this. So is Rep. Coleman and his office voting yes on this. But the main argument against it, and I understand this, that a lot of groups and people are pushing or arguing for, is that the Electoral College guarantees that states with less population, that their voices matter as much as very populated states and cities. So I mean, I can understand that argument, but again, all of our voice, I believe all our voices should matter equally. And if you live in a less populated state, your vote's still going to count. Everyone's vote is going to count equally. Right now, as I think you explained really well, right now, less populated states, those voices count more. And that is not what the founders intended, at least the non-slaveholding ones. So.
Yes. Yeah, there is a lot of history to this. I would add, like if you're really committed to the idea of one person, one vote, this is a step in the right direction. There's a lot of other things that would need to happen if we actually want to get to the founders' vision, right? Because even right now, even if we enacted this and enough states bought in, you could still have a president that wins with 40% of the vote, 30% of the vote. What we want, and I think what the founders intended, was for whoever the president was to build a broad coalition across the country. And the idea was to get to the point where a majority of the voters could approve of this person, right? We're not necessarily close to that. We've had elections where presidents have, in fact, a lot of them recently, got over 50% of the vote. But if we move away from the Electoral College, it does make it a little bit easier for third parties to come into play, right? And you can get to the point where, if you had a legitimate third party, are you comfortable with a president who was only elected by 35% of the population? We already have enough partisanship. Imagine somebody who has that power, who can appoint Supreme Court justices for life, but he was only voted on by 35% of the population, right? So there's other voting reforms that, could be valuable. You need a majority. We're going to do runoffs. We're going to do ranked choice, all these different things. So this could be a step in the right direction. But even if you're for this, I would temper your optimism about it, right? Because there's still a long way to go to actually get to, and it's funny, it feels like this is a departure from the founders' vision. This could be a step back towards it, but it's like the first baby step, okay? That's all we have time for. I'm going to invite Bobby up here to go ahead and close this out. I want to say thank you to Blythe, thank you to Reeves for coming and participating, sharing all of their knowledge and expertise with us. And with that, Bobby, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, let's give him a quick hand real quick. Thank you, guys. We want to leave you with an exit poll. So if you keep your app, computer, your phone open, there's an exit poll with just a couple quick questions. Please fill that out. But I want to thank you all for coming and being a part of this. I hope you feel more educated and informed on how your vote can impact your neighbor in ways that you might not have thought about before. Right before our event, there was a 9 News poll that said 60% of registered voters are undecided or don't know about how they're voting on the Gallagher Amendment. Right? 60% of people who are going to vote, they don't know what the thing is they're voting for. So I hope this was at least a way for you to understand and how to better civically have these discussions because I think these do need to be had. So again, thank you to everybody. One last thing, if you are interested in what's going on with the AND campaign and the Denver chapter and want to get involved or want to learn more, please do let me know. Would love to have that conversation with you. But again, thank you to our panel and everybody involved and everybody who helped. Have a good night. Thank you for coming, and go vote. Thanks.